14th July, 1943. Santo Pietro, Sicily. The dust has not yet settled over the Biscari airfield, and already something has gone terribly wrong. A column of prisoners shuffles across a scorched wheat field, hands raised, uniforms torn, faces slack with the particular exhaustion of men who believe the worst is behind them. They are wrong. Ahead of them, an American sergeant is arranging his men into a firing line. There has been no order from above authorizing this. There has been no trial, no tribunal, no accusation beyond the plain fact of surrender. Within minutes, more than 30 of these men will be dead in the dirt, and a war crime will have been committed by soldiers wearing the uniform of the United States Army. This is not a story about the enemy. It is a story about what happened on the Allied side of the line, in the chaotic first days of the invasion of Sicily, when a general's careless words collided with the raw nerves of green troops under fire for the first time. It is the story of the Biscari massacre, an atrocity that would eventually reach the desk of General George S. Patton himself, force 2 courts-martial, and leave a stain on the American record in Europe that the War Department spent years trying to keep out of the newspapers. For decades afterwards, the name Biscari meant almost nothing outside a small circle of military historians and legal scholars. It appears in none of the popular wartime newsreels, none of the triumphant accounts of the liberation of Sicily that reached American cinemas that autumn. It survives instead in court-martial transcripts, in a handful of diary entries, and in the long, careful reconstruction carried out by researchers decades later, piecing together what officers on the ground had gone to considerable lengths to obscure. That gap between what happened and what the public was allowed to know is itself part of the story, a reminder that the historical record of even the best documented war contains silences deliberately built into it. The scene that morning was one of total confusion. The airfield had changed hands more than once in the preceding hours. Men of the 45th Infantry Division, an Oklahoma National Guard outfit seeing its first combat of the war, had fought through olive groves and stone farmhouses to take the position, suffering losses that rattled officers and enlisted men alike. By early afternoon, the ground was theirs, and dozens of Italian and German soldiers had laid down their weapons. What should have followed was routine. Prisoners searched, disarmed, marched to the rear under guard. What followed instead was murder, twice over, in 2 separate incidents on the same stretch of Sicilian ground, carried out within hours of one another by men from the same regiment. Nobody planning the invasion of Sicily had prepared for this. The failure was not technological or tactical. It was moral, and it happened because a handful of men in positions of limited authority decided, in the heat of the moment, that the normal rules no longer applied to them. Understanding why requires understanding the pressure these soldiers were under, the words that had been spoken to them before the landings, and the peculiar brutality of a campaign that both sides had expected to be short, and instead turned savage almost immediately. To understand how this happened, you first have to understand what these men had just endured and what they believed they had been told to do. The 45th Infantry Division that landed near Gela on July 10, 1943, was, by its own commander's admission, unready. It was the only entirely inexperienced division taking part in the invasion, a National Guard formation built from Oklahoma, Arizona, Colorado, and New Mexico, thrown into Operation Husky alongside battle-hardened British and Canadian units under Field Marshal Montgomery. Within 48 hours of hitting the beaches, its 181st Infantry Regiment had suffered heavy casualties and struggled to meet its objectives against determined resistance from Italian coastal divisions reinforced by elements of the Hermann Göring Panzer Division. The fighting for the approaches to Biscari airfield had been especially vicious. American paratroopers who had missed their drop zones in the confusion of the night landings were found dead in the fields nearby. Some allegedly killed after capture, a detail that spread through the ranks and hardened attitudes long before the airfield itself was taken. Rumors of German snipers feigning surrender to lure Americans into the open circulated constantly. Some true, many exaggerated, all of them corrosive to discipline. Soldiers who had lost friends in the preceding days arrived at Biscari primed to see every act of surrender as a trick. Compounding this was something said, or reportedly said, by General Patton himself before the invasion began. In addresses to his officers, Patton had spoken about the need for ruthlessness against an enemy using ambush tactics, reportedly suggesting that men who kept fighting until the last possible moment before surrendering did not deserve to be taken prisoner at all. Precisely what was said, and how far down the chain of command it traveled in what form, remains disputed by historians to this day. What is not disputed is that at least one officer at Biscari believed, or later claimed to believe, that he was following a direct order when he had his men open fire on unarmed prisoners. There was no clear doctrine at the divisional level for handling large numbers of surrendering troops on a fast-moving battlefield, no rehearsed procedure that junior officers could fall back on when the fighting stopped, and prisoners began appearing faster than anyone could process them. The Geneva Convention obligations were well known in theory to every officer in the American Army. But theory is a fragile thing on a battlefield where men have just watched friends die, and where a general's throwaway remark about ruthlessness has been passed down the ranks, growing harder and more literal with every retelling. Sicily, in July 1943, offered no clean answers, only heat, fear, exhaustion, and a chain of command that had, whether by intention or carelessness, blurred the line between aggression in combat and murder after it. The wider campaign only added to the strain. Sicily was meant to be a swift stepping stone into the soft underbelly of occupied Europe, and instead it delivered 5 weeks of grueling fighting through mountainous terrain against a defense that, while eventually collapsing, resisted with far more determination than planners in London and Washington had anticipated. Temperatures on the island regularly climbed past 40 degrees Celsius. Malaria spread through units faster than replacements could be found for the men it incapacitated. Supply lines struggled to keep pace with the advance, and soldiers who had trained for months in North Africa found themselves, within days of landing, dealing with civilian casualties, destroyed villages, and the particular disorientation of fighting through a country whose population was itself deeply divided over the war. Against that backdrop of accumulated strain, the killing of prisoners at Biscari did not emerge from nowhere. It emerged from an environment in which the normal restraints on soldiers had already been worn dangerously thin, and in which at least one senior officer's words had given that erosion something close to official sanction. What made the killing at Biscari possible was not a plan. It was a permission structure, real or imagined, that reached from a general's tent all the way down to a sergeant with a Thompson submachine gun and 30-odd frightened prisoners in front of him. The first incident took place at around 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Captain John T. Compton, a company commander in the 181st Infantry Regiment, ordered a firing squad assembled from among his own men and had 36 prisoners, 34 Italians and 2 Germans, executed by rifle fire. Compton would later testify that he believed he was carrying out Patton's own instructions, delivered before the invasion, that snipers and men who fought on past the point of reasonable resistance were not entitled to quarter. Whatever the truth of that chain of communication, the men shot at Biscari that afternoon had already surrendered. They were unarmed. They posed no threat. Under any reading of military law, American or international, the killing was murder. The second incident followed only a few hours later and involved a different man entirely. Sergeant Horace T. West, a cook attached to A Company of the same regiment, took charge of roughly 40 Italian prisoners who had been gathered near the airfield. Accounts of exactly what triggered his actions vary, some pointing to a rumor that reached him about American dead found nearby, others simply to the accumulated strain of the previous days. West marched the prisoners into a field, borrowed a Thompson submachine gun from another soldier, and shot them himself, methodically, reloading as he went. When it was over, roughly 40 more men lay dead. Combined with Compton's victims, the toll at Biscari reached 73 prisoners of war killed in a single afternoon, one of the largest single atrocities committed by American forces against prisoners anywhere in the European theater. Word of the killings reached senior officers within days, and it reached Patton directly. His response, recorded in his own diary, was not one of horror at the act itself, but concern about how it might look in the press. He suggested that the officer responsible be told to claim the dead men had been snipers or had attempted to escape, rather than admit what had actually happened. It was Omar Bradley, commanding 2nd Corps and Patton's immediate subordinate, who refused to let the matter simply disappear and insisted that formal investigations proceed. Without Bradley's intervention, it is entirely possible the Biscari massacre would never have become a matter of official record at all. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The courts-martial that followed in September 1943 exposed just how uneasily the American military system handled the question of an atrocity committed by its own men. Sergeant West did not deny what he had done. He admitted to the killings outright, and his defense rested instead on a claim of temporary emotional collapse brought on by combat stress, a defense his own first sergeant contradicted on the stand. He was convicted, stripped of rank, and sentenced to life imprisonment, the most severe punishment handed down in either case. Captain Compton's trial produced a stranger outcome. Both the investigating officer and the judge advocate's office concluded that his actions had been unlawful, that no order, however loosely worded, could excuse the deliberate execution of disarmed prisoners. The court-martial panel acquitted him anyway. Rather than being punished, Compton was simply transferred to another regiment. He was killed in action in Italy a few months later, in November 1943, and never faced further consequences for Biscari. Sergeant West's life sentence did not survive contact with wartime politics for long. Fearing that news of an American war crimes conviction might provoke reprisals against American prisoners held by the Axis, Eisenhower's headquarters had West quietly detained in North Africa rather than shipped home to a federal penitentiary, and his case was kept out of the press with remarkable success given its scale. When his family began asking pointed questions about his whereabouts roughly a year later, the War Department's own Public Relations Office recognized the risk of exposure and recommended clemency before the Inspector General's investigation had even concluded, on the explicit condition that there be no publicity. In November 1944, West's sentence was remitted. He was released after little more than a year in confinement, restored to civilian life as a private soldier, his crime effectively erased from the public record for decades. The handling of both cases reveals just how carefully the Army managed the boundary between internal discipline and public accountability. Investigators, court officers, and the Judge Advocate General's own staff privately agreed that what had happened at Biscari amounted to unlawful killing, full stop, with no ambiguity about the facts. Yet at almost every stage where that conclusion might have translated into visible, lasting punishment, institutional caution intervened instead. Compton's acquittal was allowed to stand without appeal. West's sentence was quietly unwound rather than served. Neither case was permitted to develop into the kind of public reckoning that might have forced a wider conversation, in 1943 or 1944, about how American troops were being prepared, briefed, and disciplined in the field. It would take independent historians working decades later, largely without the Army's encouragement, to reconstruct the episode in anything like its full detail. Set against what German forces were doing to prisoners and civilians across occupied Europe during the very same summer, 73 deaths at Biscari can look, in the coldest arithmetic of the war, like a minor footnote. It was nothing of the sort to the men who died there, and it was not treated lightly by the American officers who eventually investigated it, several of whom argued forcefully that failing to punish the killings properly would corrode the moral authority the Allies claimed to be fighting for. The comparison Allied prosecutors themselves later had to grapple with was uncomfortable. When German officers were tried after the war for the killing of captured American soldiers, defense counsel repeatedly cited the Compton acquittal as precedent. arguing that if an American captain could murder prisoners and walk free after being found to have acted unlawfully, German officers accused of similar acts deserved no harsher treatment. American war crimes investigators were, in effect, haunted by their own army's failure to hold Biscari to account. Nothing on the German or Axis side offers a direct equivalent worth comparing, not because German forces behaved better, historically they frequently behaved very much worse, but because Biscari's peculiar shame lies specifically in what it revealed about the gap between the standards the Allies proclaimed and the justice they were willing to deliver against their own. Within the American army itself, Biscari did produce lasting change, if a slow and quiet one. Divisional and army-level training on the handling of prisoners of war was tightened in the months that followed, and commanders became noticeably more careful about the kind of pre-battle rhetoric they used with green troops. Patton's own reputation, already volatile after the slapping incidents involving shell-shocked soldiers later that same year, absorbed another layer of controversy that some historians argue Eisenhower had to actively manage and suppress to keep Patton in a field command at all. It would be more than a decade before serious historical accounts of Biscari reached print, and considerably longer before Italian historians and journalists began piecing the full picture together from American court-martial records, diaries, and testimony scattered across archives on 2 continents. The material legacy of Biscari is almost invisible today. There is no memorial at Santo Pietro, no marker at the site of the airfield to tell a visitor what happened there in the space of a single July afternoon. The wheat fields have long since returned to agricultural use. What survives instead is documentary, the court-martial transcripts held in American military archives, Patton's own diary entries, later published by the historian Martin Blumenson, and the painstaking academic reconstruction carried out by researchers such as James Weingartner, whose 1989 study remains the foundational account of what actually took place. The psychological legacy runs deeper than any physical monument could capture, a demonstration embedded permanently in the historical record that the line between disciplined soldiering and atrocity can collapse in a single afternoon, under the right combination of exhaustion, fear, ambiguous orders, and a chain of command unwilling to confront what its own troops had done. Return for a moment to that wheat field outside Santo Pietro. The airfield has been won. The guns have gone quiet. Men who should have been marched safely to the rear under guard are instead standing in loose ranks in front of soldiers who have decided, on their own authority, that the rules no longer apply. 73 of them will not walk away from that field. What happened at Biscari was not an accident of war. It was not the fog of battle claiming lives in confusion, the way artillery sometimes kills the wrong men or a patrol stumbles into an ambush in the dark. It was a choice made twice by 2 different men in 2 separate incidents, hours apart, on the same stretch of captured ground. It was murder committed by soldiers who believed, rightly or wrongly, that their commanding general had given them license to kill men who had already given up the fight. The tragedy compounds itself in the aftermath. A general who worried more about newspaper coverage than about 73 dead prisoners. A captain found to have acted unlawfully and acquitted anyway. A sergeant who confessed outright was sentenced to life and walked free within a year once his case threatened to become an embarrassment. At every stage where the system might have delivered something resembling justice, it instead delivered concealment, expedience, and silence. 73 men went into that field as prisoners of war, entitled, under every law of armed conflict, to safety, food, and eventual release. 73 men did not come out. 2 soldiers pulled the triggers, but an entire apparatus, from a general's careless words to a War Department desperate to avoid a headline, made sure that almost nobody ever answered for it. Biscari is not remembered because it changed the course of the war. It changed nothing tactically, nothing strategically, nothing in the broad sweep of the Sicilian campaign that followed. It is remembered, when it is remembered at all, because it strips away the comfortable assumption that atrocity belongs only to the other side. The uniform a man wears does not determine whether he is capable of murder. Only the choices he makes in the field, in the moment, with a rifle in his hands and a defenseless man in front of him, determine that. At Biscari, on a single July afternoon in 1943, that choice was made twice over, and the truth of it took decades to fully surface. 73 men. 2 incidents. 1 afternoon. A silence that lasted for years.